I'm Lynn Pascarella, President of the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and I'm very excited to welcome you to this afternoon's plenary with Dr. Jessie Daniels. I first met Jessie in 2017 when we were both Arthur Vining Davis Fellows in the same class in 2017 at the Aspen Institute, and I immediately called upon her to share her insights and her expertise with the AAC&U community. Jessie has contributed enormously to the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation initiative at AAC&U, providing insights from her research on internet expressions of racism and white supremacy. A faculty associate at the Harvard Berkman Klein Center and professor at Hunter College and the Graduate Center CUNY, Jessie's shaping the landscape of higher education in profound ways through her scholarship and activism. In 2020, she launched Public Scholar Academy to help faculty who aspire to be public scholars and achieve their goals, and to help university administrators who want to assess and respond to attacks on their campuses from the far right. Among her pivotal works are White Lies, published by Routledge, Cyber Racism, Roman Littlefield. And Jessie's current work includes Tweetstorm, The Rise of the Far Right, the Mainstreaming of White Supremacy, and How Tech and Media Helped, and Undoing White Womanhood, which is due to be released next year. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessie Daniels.
Thank you so much, Lynn, and I want to thank everyone at AAC&U, Tia McNair and Keisha, for helping me get the technology sorted out. And if there's any failing in the technology, it's all me. It's not on them. And I also want to thank everyone who's joining us today from wherever you are. I hope you're safe and well. I want to begin by talking about the racism and reckoning in higher education and the moment that we're living in right now, which is a remarkable one, really, in American history, I believe, and in global history as well. We're living through a moment which I hope in the future we look back on and refer to as the Great Reset, where we reflected on our values and decided to reclaim the dignity and value of human life and put that at the center of our priorities. Some scholars have been referring to this moment as the Great Reckoning, which is also, I hope, a name that we hold for this time. I think that right now we are at the beginning, both of these protests and of what the pandemic is doing to our society. And I just want to say that in the midst of all this, I'm so very grateful to the protesters who are in the streets right now for continuing to push on these important issues. So I want to talk to you today about this reckoning with regard to racism and how it's affecting higher education and the colleges and universities where we all work. Before I do that, I want to tell you just a little bit about my work, which Lynn very graciously introduced. But for those of you who are just meeting me, you may be wondering what a white woman is doing talking about these issues. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the work that I've been doing for the last 25 years. So Lynn mentioned these two books. White Lies came out in 1997 and Cyber Racism came out in 2009. And in between those two books, I went to work in the .com industry and for lots of reasons, which I could talk about in the Q&A. But what ended up happening is that these two books I was researching on white supremacy ended up coming out on sort of either side of the divide created by the rise of the popular internet. So it really launched me into thinking about the role that the internet is playing and how racism is manifest in society. And pretty much since then, I've really been thinking about how the internet is having a role in spreading racism and also in ways of resisting racism. At the same time, I've been, well, I should also say, and Lynn mentioned the Tweetstorm book, which is still in process. And this is a brief article I did in 2018 that talked about the algorithmic rise of the far right. And basically what that has to do with is since the cyber racism research finished, that I finished that in 2008, it's published in 2009, that the internet has really changed. So the internet that I was writing about for the cyber racism book is really different now. And part of what's different about it is what we refer to as algorithms. So these formulas that make the internet work. It's the thing that when you've been searching for an item to purchase, say a new pair of sneakers, and then suddenly you go to another website and those sneakers appear everywhere. That's the result of algorithms, and it's part of what serves up search returns for us on the internet. It's also part of what serves up white supremacy for people who begin to search for things like that. And it's part of what led Dylan Roof to that church. We're now 5 years past the massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, but part of what led Dylan Roof to that church was a search engine after he had put in black on white crime, and it led him to a white supremacist site. So that's part of what I've been looking at in the last couple of decades of my research. And I've also been very interested in, there are a couple of other books that I finished not too long ago, one in 2016 and the other in 2018, about how the internet is changing our jobs as academics and what it means to be an academic in the internet era. And part of what I argue with my two friends and co-authors of these books is that we are all public scholars now in the digital era. And I'll say more about the implications of that and what that means in terms of the reckoning around racism that we're facing right now. So I want to go on and say just a little bit about social media and the world that our students, and here I'm talking about traditional age students, so 18 to 24-year-olds, and what they've grown up with in terms of social media platforms. When we talk about social media, right now most people think about Facebook, and it's certainly the behemoth of social media platforms. It's got the most users at billions. It is almost like some people have called it a utility. It's so pervasive, it's like running water in houses now. But it hasn't always been the case. And the social media landscape has changed very rapidly. So Facebook, YouTube, and Reddit have been around for about 10 years, but newer sites like TikTok have emerged very quickly and are growing exponentially in ways that, and are being used by young people, by our students in really new and innovative ways. So TikTok began in September of 2016, and by 2018, the middle of 2018, it had already reached 500 million, that's billion with a B, users. So that means at some point TikTok was gaining an average of 20 million new users per month over this period. The other thing to keep in mind is that I've been around the internet long enough to have this always sort of present in my mind. There are also social media platforms that have gone away. So for example, in 2008, about the time I finished the cyber racism book, MySpace and Friendster were close competitors for Facebook, and now those have practically gone away. And there was a moment in 2006 in which MySpace temporarily surpassed Google in terms of the monthly active users. So, you know, part of what I wanted to illustrate with that is that our students have grown up with social media, but they've also grown up with a social media landscape that's constantly changing. So they're used to that sort of dynamic aspect of social media. Another thing to keep in mind is that the students who are enrolling in college this fall, whatever that looks like, have probably never licked a postage stamp, but they've always had Google and YouTube and Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest and all the rest. So the other thing to keep in mind about the atmosphere and the climate and the culture in which our students have grown up in is that they also have come to expect and to be aware of racism in the culture. So this is data from the Pew Research Center, fabulous data there. I always like to give a plug to the Pew Research Center for those of you who are teaching data analysis. You can download all their data and use it in your classes if you're teaching how to do analysis in your work. But this is from a 2009 survey that they did, and they said that most people, and this is across racial categories, most say it's now more common for people to express racist or racially insensitive views. And this is since the 2016 election. So this is also part of the environment that our students are growing up in and that they're becoming used to. I want to, sorry, I'm just gonna put in my headphones really quickly to deal with some ambient noise here, I apologize. Right, so our students have grown up with this social media atmosphere. They've also grown up with ambient racism, but it's not necessarily new. I know there's new stories happening in the news about racism online and students and college campuses, but it's been going on pretty much since the internet has been happening. This is a story from 2015 about an incident that happened at the University of Oklahoma. It referred to the hidden racism of young white Americans, but I don't know that that is necessarily so hidden. The Nation recently asked the question, this is from 2008, is social media normalizing campus on racism? I would argue that it is normalizing campus racism, but not in the way that we might necessarily think. And it's also not as new as we might imagine. So this is a piece from a blog that I've maintained for several years now called Racism Review. And it's about a racist video that went viral at the University of California, Los Angeles, when a student by the name of Alexandra Wallace created a YouTube video that mocked the Asian American students in her, at her library. And that video went viral. The University of UCLA decided not to discipline Alexandra Wallace, and she later withdrew from the university, saying that she had gotten death threats. There was no documentation of the death threats, but the assumption is that she was quite embarrassed about the video. One of the people that I follow on Twitter who tweets under Angry Asian Man, and I had a conversation at the time, this is in 2011, about being a little disappointed that Alexandra Wallace had left UCLA, because we both share the opinion that this was probably the main place that she was going to unlearn the racism that she was displaying in this racist video. This is true, and I wrote a long blog post about is redemption possible for Alexandra Wallace at the time, and I sort of charted out what I think might have been possible for her and how she could have redeemed herself after this. And I still think that's true. Unfortunately, what started to happen with Alexandra Wallace, and she sort of disappeared from the internet, I don't know where she is now, but what started to happen with her is that she began to be a darling of the far right, and even the way that she talked about her own experience was as a victim. And I think too that even though Angry Asian Man and I had good intentions, in some ways it was the wrong emphasis. It shouldn't have been an emphasis on Alexandra Wallace, which is what happens when these racist incidents get press. It should have really been an emphasis on what the impact of that was on the other students. So right now we're living through this moment where high school students and alums are using social media to expose racism. This is a story that was just in the New York Times, and I'm starting to get press calls about this. There's really very important research that was just done by Boston University sociologist Rob Eshman. And basically what he did was he went through and looked at online environments, so different kinds of online spaces where students are sharing their views. And he found expressions of racism in these online spaces. And then he interviewed the students of color who had encountered these expressions of racism online. And basically what he found was that this was very alienating for them. It left them depressed, it left them anxious, it left them feeling not welcome at their institutions. And that really should be the emphasis and the focus for us when we're considering what to do, what the implications are of racist expressions online on colleges and university campuses. What's the impact on students of color at those institutions, and how are we responsible to them for creating an atmosphere in which they can learn and grow and thrive? What we've seen in the recent news headlines about these incidents of racism that have been exposed online is that some colleges and universities have been saying, we can't do anything about it. The Chronicle of Higher Education featured this in a headline. Others, some colleges say that their hands are tied. In the Inside Higher Ed, they focused on the colleges and campuses where they are rescinding offers of admission to students. And I think it's significant that from what I've read, these offers are around issues that, around students who have scholarships, athletic or academic scholarships, and that's part of what is being rescinded in these. But this is also part of how this hate speech and racism online gets normalized, and I'll show you a little bit about this in this one higher ed piece. This is just from the other day. So in about the 12th paragraph down in this piece by the Inside Higher Ed, the reporter refers to the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE, and describes it as a civil liberties watchdog group that advocates for free speech on college campuses. Well, that all sounds fine, except it's not. With a little investigation, there's a wonderful site called SourceWatch, which I recommend to everyone. You find out that Foundation for Individual Rights in Education is actually a project of one particular professor who is intent on this idea of intellectual diversity. And this is a way of hijacking the language of diversity and using it to smuggle in conservative ideas and to move things to the right. Part of the intention of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education is to attack what he calls the so-called liberal bias in higher ed. And if you look further at SourceWatch about who's funding this enterprise, you can see that it's a collection of the usual right-wing billionaires. And in 2016, the latest year for which we have numbers, their revenue for this group was over $6 million. So this is not simply a debate about ideas, but this is an ideological battle that those on the right are funding in higher education to undermine what we think of as the goals, the usual goals of higher education and the humanities and the liberal arts. These are antithetical to people on the right. And it's, when I talk about white supremacy, I mean a whole range of people and actors. So usually what people are thinking about when they think about white supremacy are the white nationalists, the ones that show up with torches and in robes and hoods at a particular time in history. But right now, what we're seeing with white nationalists on college and university campuses is a real effort at trying to mainstream white supremacy in a particular kind of way. Now, this report from the Kansas City Star is from early in this year, February of 2020, and this is right before everything began to shut down for COVID. But I want you to see what they were planning at that time. So this is February of 2020, and the white nationalist movement was really making plans and concerted effort to show up in person on college and university campuses. Part of the way that they were doing that was through the school clubs and organizations. They see that as a real pathway in to their presence on campus. So it's very likely that white supremacists are already on your campus and they don't necessarily have torches. They're very likely in the student organizations, the student clubs, and they've targeted those because those organizations often get line item funding from student fees. And so they've argued, they see that as an opportunity for advancing their ideological agenda by taking over the student fees that are already allocated. So this raises a real dilemma, and it has real unexpected consequences for faculty who are not maybe aware of what's happening on campuses in terms of this right-wing activity. So this is from not long ago in the Chronicle of Higher Education. There have been many faculty who have argued that we need a more activist academy. That means faculty are feeling compelled, especially at moments like this when we have, a real uprising in the streets, to make their work relevant to what's happening in the street and to sort of shine as scholar activists. Yet that impulse, if you will, is really butts up against a real bind in the academy. And I'll tell you what this bind looks like in some ways based on the experience of a colleague of mine who's at one of the other CUNY campuses at Brooklyn College. This is Lori Rubel, who's a mathematics professor at Brooklyn College. And she published a peer-reviewed article in her field, which is mathematics education. And what she talked about in this peer-reviewed article, which is excellent, was about the way that we usually teach mathematics reproduces whiteness in various ways. And these right-wing groups, such as Campus Reform, they have full-time staff people whose job it is, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, is to cull through the table of contents of peer-reviewed journal articles and find things that they believe reveals this liberal bias in higher education. And they pulled her article. Lori Rubel has very little social media presence, but they pulled her peer-reviewed article and they began to go after her in the right-wing media sphere, on Twitter, on Facebook, and to call her university, her college, and to give her grief for that. So this is the kind of atmosphere that faculty are contending with, even as their students are immersed in social media and battered by the kind of systemic racism that they're dealing with. Faculty are also dealing with these unintended consequences, even when they try to become scholar activists. So that leads us to the moment we're in now. And the moment that we all experienced in the spring semester, the COVID-19 pivot, as some people were referring to it, as a lot of people were giddy almost with the COVID-19 as a pivot point to online learning for people who wanted to see that happen. But one of the unexpected consequences of the pivot to online learning in the spring was the presence of Zoom bombing. I don't know if any of you read or heard about or experienced this yourselves, but as we all moved to online classes via the commercial platform Zoom, many of these were disrupted by active racists who wanted to disrupt classes, dissertation defenses, even synagogue meetings. The other thing that I think goes unmentioned a lot of times in higher education when we're talking about COVID death and the pivot to online learning is the incredible racial gaps in COVID illness and death rates. I felt this especially at CUNY, where many of the students in my classes were not dealing with COVID as simply a shift in the method of their online learning, but they were dealing with family members, with parents, with relatives who were sick, and many of whom were deceased. And I think that what we have to recognize when we move into the fall semester, no matter what that looks like, is that we're dealing with students who, especially students of color, who have been traumatized by systemic racism, whether it's police brutality or it's COVID and the disproportionate death rates from COVID-19. I believe that as many people have called for a long overdue revolution in higher education because of COVID-19, I think that what we're really confronting is a long overdue reckoning in higher education. And we have to take into account systemic racism and the way that our institutions are contributing to that. And this is certainly the point that Christiane Warren made recently in higher education, inside higher ed, when she was saying that colleges must take a new approach to systemic racism. And this is part of what we have to confront in the looming financial fallout. As many colleges and universities are confronting shortfalls in their budgets, there's going to be a real push to eliminate ethnic studies programs. We saw this already, I believe it was at Ohio State University, where the first faculty who experienced layoffs or cuts were African American studies faculty. So there's going to be a real way in which there's a kind of disaster capitalism logic operating at colleges and universities with these shortfalls in the budget. And so we've got to be even more vigilant about advocating for racial equity. And I just want to shout out a couple of efforts in this regard. One is by Dr. Sean Harper, who is pushed forward this effort to tackle racial inequity. And part of what he's doing with this is he's asked the colleges who've joined this effort to pony up actual funds, $25,000 each, in order to participate in this. And it's an interesting strategy, I think, in terms of getting people to put their money where their mouth is in terms of commitment to ending racial inequity. I also want to mention efforts to defund the police on campuses. I think there's a real way in which one of the strategies for meeting the budget shortfalls that we're going to have going forward is to think about what kind of money we're spending on security and law enforcement on college campuses. So that's another place to think about systemic racism on campus. So there really is a time right now for reckoning about racism in colleges and universities. And I want to just close by saying that I think as I'm working on this book now on undoing white womanhood, and I just want to say that I think we as white women, those of us who are white women on the call, we have a real particular responsibility for the systemic racism that people are having to confront right now. This is an image from 1957 of women who were in the United Daughters of the Confederacy at a Confederate memorial. Most people on this call may not realize, but the majority of Confederate monuments on college campuses and around the US are there as a result of the organizing, fundraising, and propaganda efforts of white women who were in the Daughters of the Confederacy. And these went up not during the Civil War immediately after it, but in several decades following. And this is remarkably an uprising at the Richmond, Virginia headquarters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy just in the last few weeks. And here is a Confederate statue that was taken down at University of Oregon very recently. So I just want to say that this is the kind of moment that we're in, and that we have a real opportunity in this moment to have a reset that centers the values of humanities and liberal arts and puts human dignity at the center. I thank you all so much for your time and attention. And that's my contact information. If you have questions that we don't get to in the Q&A, please feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to engage with you further. And I think that Lynn is going to lead some Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Jessie. That was just wonderful.
Sure.
A reminder that you can ask questions with the Q&A function, and we are eager to take them. But let me start with the first question of, I know that you've had this challenge on your campus, and I certainly did as a college president, with faculty who are attacked. I was sent a list of faculty members with their pictures and the pictures of their children and the schools that their children attended, and was concerned about their safety, and was able to take some steps to address those issues. How should college leaders be handling attacks on faculty when they serve as public scholars?
I think it's a great question. As you know, I'm very concerned about this, Lynn. I think that, you know, not all university and college administrators are as enlightened and forward thinking as you are. I think that the first step really is for college and university administrators to be aware that this is a possibility, that faculty who are doing work that challenges the status quo in any way, that challenges racial inequality, that challenges white supremacy, that those faculty, even if they don't have social media presence, are very much targets of the right wing in this culture that we're in right now. I think the other thing to think that college and university administrators need to think about is how they might coordinate efforts on campus to ensure the safety of their faculty. So for example, when I was attacked, this was in the fall of 2017, part of what happened to me is that the people who work in IT, that is all the people that manage our email system, were not speaking to the people in public safety, and the people in public safety weren't speaking to the people in the press office, and the people in the press office were speaking to the administrators, but not to anybody else. And I think that those different units within a university or college need to coordinate efforts across public safety, across what's the messaging the university is going to put out, what's the and what is the tangible threat. One of the people at my institution asked me later, well, for a record of this incident that happened to you, why don't you go through and keep a file, make a copy of all the emails that you got that were death threats or rape threats or threats to harm you. I went ahead and did that, but you know, someone in IT could have done that with 2 or 3 keystrokes. So, I mean, I think that we have to recognize that when these things happen, there are trauma and for the faculty that's going through it. And we have to think about how do we minimize that trauma, and how do we protect not only the individual faculty member, but how do we protect the institution? Because the point is, they're not just coming after me individually, they're really coming after what we do in higher education. And we've got to find ways to protect the very enterprise that we're engaged in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the primary concerns that has been raised by many individuals is how do we balance free speech and our desire to protect our community from hate speech in order to meet our obligation to provide equal access to education. So what do we do about people who utter hateful speech, or this concern has been raised in the question and answer function of what do you do if you're in a conversation like this and somebody has a white supremacist t-shirt on?
Right. I mean, I think that there are real opportunities in colleges and universities to talk about community standards. You know, it's not, I think in some ways the argument about free speech is a way in which those on the far right use that language because we all share it as a value, but they use that language to further their agenda. I think when we're talking about college and universities, we already have really clear precedents for saying, look, this is a community and these are our community standards, and you have to abide by these community standards if you're going to continue to be part of this community. And I think that it's not difficult really to say, you know, we don't tolerate racist speech. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the cyber racism book is drawing on, is this actual debate? And it really comes up in a lot of ways because of the global nature of the internet, right? So that our very parochial way of understanding the First Amendment and free speech in the United States doesn't hold up when we talk about the internet and in a global context. And part of what I found really persuasive in doing that research was a more human rights frame for talking about free speech, which is what they've adopted in Western Europe. So for example, in Germany, for example, people talk about how do you balance the human right to exist with free speech. You can still value free speech and say people have a right to exist and not have their existence threatened. And you can balance those two off of each other without sort of going overboard and saying free speech at any cost, even if you're threatening to annihilate people based on their racial or ethnic identity. And I really think that as we move to a more global understanding of free speech, a more global sense of the ways that we're interconnected, and I think COVID-19 has certainly been an opportunity for thinking about our interconnections, that we're going to have to move to a more of a human rights frame on free speech, where we see it as balanced against the right not to be annihilated.
Mm. There's certainly been a lot of controversy around the use of student evaluation of teachers and the ways in which there are hidden biases involved in those. What do we do about the fact that some students will enact their racist attitudes in poor evaluations that ultimately impact the careers of faculty of color?
No, I think that's a really great question. And from what I've been reading, there are people who are advocating that we move away from, in some ways, the heavy reliance on student evaluations precisely for that built-in bias. I mean, I think we've got to listen to what students say, but we also have to acknowledge that there's bias in those student evaluations, and we have to, in some ways, compensate for them, overcompensate for them in other forms of evaluation, so that if, for example, there's an instructor who's being evaluated by students, an instructor who's a person of color is being evaluated by predominantly white students at a predominantly white institution, somewhere else in the evaluation process, there has to be a way to weight against that bias, whether it's in peer reviews from other faculty, also has its own problems, or if it's in some other external review process that happens. But I think that we have to take that into account. Otherwise, we're just replicating the bias that faculty face in the classroom.
One of our participants greatly appreciates the discussion on meritocracy. I think we all do, and wants to know if you have a reaction to the recent book, The Meritocracy Trap by Daniel Markovits, and the underlying concerns that he says, as someone who's involved in graduate student selection, how should this understanding impact our selection process as students from these prep schools consistently have the highest GRE scores and the most diverse volunteer internship experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm sorry I haven't gotten a chance to read that book yet, but I have read and do recommend Patricia Matthews' Written Unwritten, which talks about some of the same issues in tenure and promotion for faculty of color, and I highly, highly recommend that book. And part of what Tricia Matthew talks about is the way in which meritocracy and the way in which excellence and standards, that language, gets weaponized against faculty of color who are going up for promotion. And I see it too in the student applications, and what the person in the question and answer was raising. I think we see that all the way through these systems that we refer to as meritocracy systems, the way that things like standards and excellence and the reputation of previous institutions that people have been to work to reproduce inequality. We've really got to find ways to interrupt that system, and I think that that one of those ways is really reconfiguring our evaluation process so that it's not simply on standardized tests. I think one of the bright lights out of the COVID crisis has been the reevaluation of standardized testing. The fact that people couldn't show up to do the test was part of the impetus for those tests going away. But I think that if this turns out to be the Great Reset, I think that's going to be one of the greatest advantages for admissions going forward, if we can get away from those standardized tests, because they simply reproduce inequality.
Mm-hmm. And one of the most frightening messages in your work is the extent to which the far right is so well organized and can act quickly and mobilize immense resources of all sorts And so one of our participants is wondering how we can encourage faculty who really don't know about the ways in which the alt-right is hijacking our colleges and universities now to work together to create our own assets.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things I want to just clarify a little bit what the premise of your question. The white supremacists really are organized, but they're not unified, which I think is to our advantage. I think the other thing about the white supremacist movement, just going, if you look back historically in the United States, they're relentless. It's the other quality, I would say. But I think that they're fractured, and that works to our advantage. So what I would say in terms of faculty and administrators and students who are concerned about the far right and who are in colleges and universities is that we have to take, first of all, we have to take a long view about the struggle for racial equality and against racial inequity. And I think that that's part of what's happening now with the uprisings, with the protests in the street. I mean, I'm just in such awe of people who are in the streets now going on, what is it, 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks? I mean, and that's the kind of stamina and staying power that we need for looking at these issues going forward. You know, we need to really take the long view. And we have to realize that it's going to take a real, it's going to have to take a lot of nuance for us to think about the issues that are going on with white supremacy in this country. I'll just give you one example. I often get this question from reporters who are interested in white supremacy online. They want to know, is it the same as ISIS? Are they recruiting in the same way that ISIS is? And there are just so many things wrong with that question. But what I usually end up saying is some version of, look, ISIS is a religious group on the other side of the world. And when people get recruited into ISIS, they're being recruited into a whole different cultural milieu. When people are being radicalized, and I prefer that term when we're talking about white supremacy online in the US, when people are being radicalized into white supremacy in the US, they're being radicalized into believing the words of some of the founders of the country. When I was spending time on Stormfront for my research on, for the cyber racism book, one of the banners on that white supremacist portal, Stormfront, featured Thomas Jefferson and a quote from Notes on the State of Virginia. So if we are talking about white supremacy, extremist white supremacy in the United States, what we have to grapple with is the way that white supremacy is written into the Constitution of the United States, the way that it's written into the very foundations of this country. And I'm just going to say, most white people, given the way that our educational institutions are structured, do not have the capacity for dealing with that at a very sophisticated level. We, at the most, I'll just use myself as an example. I didn't really understand much about race until I went to graduate school, and I was in my 20s then. So if you're talking about most people in the United States who never go to graduate school, they're dealing with racism at a very basic level if they haven't experienced it themselves and they haven't done the work of reading about it or learning about it. So it's actually a very big task to get people who have been raised white in this culture to start thinking in more complicated and nuanced ways about the system of white supremacy that we find ourselves in.
Well, we have many important questions. I'll ask this one final question, and you have a minute to respond.
Okay.
From a participant who wonders, we've seen systems and institutions move and shift in the past due to social pressures, the civil rights movement. However, they always find a way to self-correct and continue to produce their intended products. Why should people of color feel this will be any different?
Well, don't take my word for it, but take the word of Angela Davis. And Angela Davis was on a call just the other day saying this moment is different. And I believe Angela Davis. I think we're really experiencing something. There's been a confluence of events, both from the pandemic and from the sustained protests, that I think really makes this different. And it's incumbent on all of us to keep pushing for change.
Thank you so very much. It was a real pleasure.
Okay. Thanks so
Um,
much for having me.
Oh, of course. A reminder that you now have a half-an-hour break. Your next meeting is your cluster meetings at 2:30 Eastern time. And so we'll look forward to seeing you there. Thank you all for participating.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.